So thank you very much for joining us tonight here at the Dearborn Library. I'm very happy and very pleased to have author Matthew Specktor to joining us tonight. His wonderful new book, The Golden Hour, a story of family and power in Hollywood. It's a wonderful read. I look forward to getting back to reading it. That doesn't happen too often.
Always a good sign, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I just as like, yeah, and many other reasons. I just, hey, let's talk to see if Matthew wants to talk. So glad you're going to join us. We'll be talking for 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be a Q&A after,
Great.
short Q&A after. And then just wanted to highlight a couple upcoming programs. Next Tuesday, June 3rd, I'll be talking virtually with the cartoonist Harry Bliss, about his new graphic memoir, You Can Never Die. Then on June 17th, I'll be talking in person with Elliot Wilhelm. He runs the Detroit Film Theater in the Detroit Institute of Arts, talking about how he's shows the films, chooses the films to show, all the different aspects of running a great theater in the Detroit Institute of Arts. So please join us then. So yeah, uh, as I said, I really enjoyed the book, Matthew. It just was. It just spoke to me. It was like lived in. It's just like wonderful, wonderful writing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's I sometimes feel like writing about Hollywood or the movies, which I've done a couple of times now, is a tough remit. Sometimes I think also for readers because it sets up certain expectations that I might in some cases be trying to frustrate a little bit. Just in terms of I don't know. I think of people tend to think of Hollywood as a world apart from the rest of the world, and as a place of great superficiality and of sort of high glamour, and I suppose a little bit of glamour is okay, but I was sort of digging for something human with this book, so it's nice to hear that response from you.
Yeah, I did. I certainly the book used some of the idea or the points in your book that the glamour is kind of fading away. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, that's it certainly. I think in the 21st century, the sort of old Hollywood of kind of movie stars and premieres and that's definitely gone. And in some respects, maybe good riddance. But we there are certainly more important things that we are losing besides that. But I do think that somehow the sense of a kind of common cultural vernacular, or a kind of a culture that kind of spoke to a large slice of the world, having that disappear is there is a real loss that attends that goes beyond, I think, just the movies.
yeah, that's when the president was talking about tariffs, that the the idea is that there could be counter tariffs, and that's very unfortunate because a lot of uh, make a lot of money in foreign markets.
I think they make more that I mean, for certainly, I mean, the question of whether the president's going to tariff, foreign-made movies is nobody really understands how that would work. I doubt that he really understands how that would work entirely, and but it would be devastating because I think movies now make far more money abroad than they do domestically, and have actually for quite some time.
Now, your novel, I've heard you describe it in previous talks being like a biographical novel. Uh,
Which novel? This, I mean, are we referring to The Golden Hour, which of course isn't a novel, it's a memoir, but it's so like a novel, and its perspectives are other than so much of it is told in from points of view that aren't mine. So I have kind of copped to the fact that it is a nonfiction novel, a term that makes me a little uncomfortable, but it existed. It's existed for a while. I'd be happy to call it that. But I also think every book I've ever written, to some extent, the things that declared themselves as novels. My last novel, American Dream Machine, had tremendous kind of autobiographical elements involved. I've always felt like that distinction for me between what is novel, what is criticism, what is memoir. It's a little blurry, and at this point, I'd have to say blurry by design.
Well, you mentioned Tom Wolfe in the book. Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you kind of hint at the new journalism
Yes. Well,
that
sure. Yeah. Yeah. I
and
think that was
they weren't straightforward. Yeah, they had
No, 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 no. And it's
um,
funny because those writers were not, Wolf and Mailer and Gay Talese and stuff. That was not. I never. They were not people that I grew up reading. They're not people that I would ever have kind of counted as a. I mean, I have read them with varying degrees of pleasure. Um, Norman Mailer, who's a very both aggravating, and infuriating, and sometimes quite wonderful writer. It's but I definitely felt like there was some lineage between those books and this one for sure.
yeah, you talk about you have wonderful uh, parts where you talk about Lou Osterman, James Baldwin,
Yeah.
uh, Huey Newton. They're
Yeah.
just I, I guess I have to ask how much was that true and how much
It was as true as I could make it. There was, there was I was very intent on, not deforming the historical record, and so, I mean, I'll take James Baldwin as an example because Mr. Baldwin was my undergraduate professor, in my sophomore year. He was my creative writing professor, and he did, in fact, commute from the south of France to Western Massachusetts to teach this one class a week, which of course meant that he didn't show up every week. But I knew that I did a tremendous amount of research into. I mean, I knew his work, and I knew that he had in fact had a lifelong engagement with the movies that he, in many ways had wanted to write for the theater. And then kind of had spent a lot of time. There was a Malcolm X biopic, and he was very, very, very very passionate about film, and he wrote a book, in fact, about the movies and about the sort of about his life in the movies called The Devil Finds Work. And so every sort of biographical fact, every sentiment, there's a section of the book where I'm writing from inside, Baldwin's perspective or consciousness, and all of that is true. I spent a lot of time figuring out, what was the flight route he would have taken from how would he have gotten from St. Paul de Vence to Hartford, Connecticut, which was the nearest airport. And then, I was looking for old in-flight magazines to figure out like what movies were they showing on the plane. In my case, I have him watching Footloose, which, I have no idea whether James Baldwin ever saw Footloose. There was a little bit of kind of it was a little bit of a joke, but it also felt like a place where that movie would have been shown on an airplane in October 1986, and it seemed as likely as any other. And sort of, it was fun to sort of think like, what on earth would Baldwin have made of this kind of goofy, a very popular movie? So there was some license there, but I think it was still fairly embedded in the kind of biographical realities, and in that case, the remembered realities of who he was and what he was like in the classroom and what he talked about. And that was in many ways, those sections of the book, the sections where I was kind of entering the consciousness of these kind of historical figures, they were the most fun parts for me to write by far, and in some ways the most, I don't want to say the most autobiographical, but there is something that I am in my heart a fiction writer, and there is I feel like I can get closer to myself writing about other people, in many ways, being a memoirist, even though I've now written two memoirs in a row, is a little bit, it goes against my grain. I think I don't like to think of myself as the main character in many respects of anything. Uh,
Yeah, if you want to, you don't want to write about yourself per se. You want to be writing about others.
Yeah, that's correct. Oh, having said that, I certainly do write about myself in this book, and it always crashing in the same car. But there's much more. There's a directness to that in this book, and much to my surprise, because I think that was the aspect of the book that I was most sort of worried about. I just thought, gosh, this is going to be people might find this really obnoxious, and I don't. Perhaps some do. I'm sure some do, but the experience I have had thus far with readers have not been that. So it's really lovely.
Well, certainly growing up in Hollywood, uh, for someone who hasn't grown up in Hollywood, and you see oh yeah, you hang around all the stars and everything, and then you growing up in the Hollywood area, you just it's like everyday happening. Well,
Sort of. I mean, I think that that's true, and I think that the kind of demystification of that came pretty early for me. But it was also true that I think, a lot of what I grew up around were sort of working actor, television actors, people who were not, they weren't huge stars. I mean, we would have kind of encounters with these people on occasion, but the kind of regular day-to-day life, and I don't think, my father, who's now 92 and still, he's a very successful talent agent, and he goes to the office every day, and he makes deals for his clients who are people now in his, more or less in his age bracket. He sort of represents the Helen Mirrens and the Morgan Freemans and the sort of old lions of the movie business. Um, but when I was growing up, he didn't really have clients who were stars. And so it was a very different kind of, it really was a little earthier. There would be people like, I don't know, Peter Falk. I mean, Peter Falk is a star kind of, but he was like a television star. He wasn't Robert Redford or Paul Newman. Everything was a little smaller scale. And I think that kind of, and I mean, I think it also helped that my dad is a pretty down to earth person, and always has been, even at the most you know kind of star saturated points of his career. I don't think that's ever been a big value for him. So I think, it was a household that I never sort of felt like the world that I was growing up in was unusual, but thanks to the efforts of both of my parents, I think, and just thanks to who they were, it never sort of felt like, because most of my friends had their families were not in the movie business, so I was aware of a kind of distinction, um, and I was aware of people for whom, if you grow up in that world or live in that world, you kind of lose touch with every other with what I'm still forced to call the real world, which is to say everything else. And I don't think my parents ever did. That my family was still pretty close to kind of a more ordinary middle class experience.
well, let's talk about your dad.
Yeah.
For those out there who don't know what an agent does, can you briefly talk about that?
Yeah. So a talent agent, and we've all kind of seen them, I think, depicted in, the most famous representation of one in the 21st century is probably Ari Gold in Entourage. They're sort of popularly understood to be these kind of very superficial, very temperamental, very kind of high-powered characters. And what they do is they negotiate employment for actors and directors and filmmakers, and they basically are the people who go and get their clients paid and kind of book them into to do certain movies. Or an agent might say, no, I don't think you should do that one. I think you should do this one. So my dad went to work in the late 50s for a man named Lou Wasserman, who was very, very, very famous, kind of the talent agent of the early 20th century, who represented, Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis and, all the big stars of the Silver Age of Hollywood, but also, um, among many other things, represented Ronald Reagan and was sort of part of a big part of kind of once Reagan had sort of washed out of the movies. He had a lot to do with kind of, helping to launch Reagan's subsequent political career and so on. Um, and um, and so that was my dad's first boss. My dad was Wasserman's assistant. Um, and then he kind of went to work for a different agency and then eventually went on to join what was then a very small agency called Creative Artists Agency, who are now kind of the most dominant talent agency in Hollywood and have a tremendous amount of influence, not just in movies, but in sports and books and branding and, you know, YouTube influencers and TikTokers and
Well,
and
every
everything.
place you can
Yeah,
make money.
yeah, every place, right.
Well, first off, is there a sign on the door at CA that says "Be like Fred Specktor"?
Yeah, this was a shock to me. So he really has been there for a long time. So long that he is the not just the oldest person at the company, but really the only person who's been working there since he was since the company was founded. It was founded in 1975, and he started working there in 1978. Everybody who founded it is gone. Um, the fellow who is now the president of the company, Richard Lovett, was my father's assistant in the early 1980s, and I think that my dad, who is very much not like Ari Gold, he's actually a sort of person of some sensitivity and conscience. I mean, he's impossible in some ways. He's my dad. Dads will always drive their children crazy a little bit, but he's a really he's very well liked and respected in the industry, I think, for being a guy with not just for his longevity, but for having a certain kind of youthfulness of outlook, and a kind of optimistic spirit. So at some point last year, they decided, in the Los Angeles office, it's in the elevator. It's on the doors of the elevator, which have these kind of frosted glass doors, and it says, "Be like Fred Specktor," or "Be optimistic, be like Fred Specktor, start today." And I went to the London office a couple months ago and walked in, and I could see the same thing was kind of etched into the wall of the conference room in the lobby. And I asked, apparently that's in every office they have around the world. He's sort of now their shining example of what they want the young agents to become.
Well, I got the feeling from the book that what he likes is almost like putting himself in people's shoes.
He does, I think.
And,
He said
and
something to me recently that was very interesting, which was that he had to go kind of negotiate something with his bosses at work. And he said to me, he said, it's funny. He said, I'm so good at advocating for other people, but I'm not as good at advocating for myself. And in some ways, I think like, that's kind of why agents exist, is because, most artists aren't good at that either. I feel like, thank God for my agent, my literary agent, my film agent. I would probably just be completely indigent if not for those people who are, kind of who saved me from my kind of more foolishly generous impulses. But um, I think for my dad, it was a moment where I thought, oh, I understand. Like it made me, I think my dad became an agent somewhat by accident, but continued at it and succeeded at it because he really does care about and enjoy fighting for his clients. If he has a writer or a director or an actor whose talent he believes in, he'll really go to the wall for them. And it's been interesting over the years to see, in the very early 1960s, he represented Jack Nicholson for a while, and he couldn't get Jack Nicholson a job. This was when Nicholson was just starting out, and everybody was like, that guy's too strange, he's just too intense, or people didn't want to hire him. And I think in the late 70s, my dad started representing Danny DeVito, and Danny was not an enormously castable figure at that time too. It was like, really, you think that guy's a movie star? He doesn't look like a movie star. Um, and I think for him, the pleasure he takes in the job is when he can find someone like that, or anyone whose talent he really believes in, and kind of help them uh, succeed. I think he finds that much easier to do for other people and kind of impossible to do for himself. I can relate to that somehow.
Yeah, yeah, that's very human, I guess,
Yeah,
very,
yeah.
very relatable. Your mom, she grew up, she uh, had a career as a screenwriter.
Yeah, a very brief career as a screenwriter. She was someone who I think she did not grow up in. Both of my parents are from Los Angeles, and my mom did not grow up anywhere near the movie business, but she I think went to work. She kind of dabbled with being an actress, and then she went to work as a secretary at one of the for at CBS TV, and then at one of the agencies she met my dad. But she was someone who she did want to be a writer. I think she wanted to be a novelist, is what she really wanted to be. And she kind of, I don't want to say fell into screenwriting by accident. She was offered a chance to rewrite a movie, um, which she did. And the movie's not bad, but I mean, the movie got made, but she also happened to do it during a strike when the Writers Guild of America was on strike, and she got blackballed from the Writers Guild, and that it didn't stop people from hiring her entirely, but it kind of it, it hurt her career badly, and she had problems with alcohol, so she didn't have much of a career, and in many ways it was such a mystery because my mother was not only a very kind of committed reader and really quite a brilliant person and a very talented writer, but she was also someone with very fairly left-leaning and labor sympathetic politics. So, I mean, explicitly, she was very into kind of folk music in the late 50s and early 60s, and I remember her taking me to see a documentary about the Wobblies when I was in 10th grade. Like, she was very, very, very intent on sort of teaching me that about the history of labor in the States, and so that she would cross a picket line during a strike was something very hard for me to square with my understanding of who my mom uh, was or wanted to be. Um, it was difficult, and I think difficult for her too.
And you talk about how essentially movies, the making of movies became more corporatized, I guess,
Yeah, yeah,
throughout the movie.
that's exactly right. And that was part of, that was kind of my experience. I went to work for a studio in the 90s, and really it happened to be right at the moment when studios were in the kind of olden days of Hollywood, the studios were owned by the people who founded them, right? I mean, the Warner
Yeah.
Brothers was called Warner Brothers because of the the brothers named Warner who founded it and all that. And then in the 60s, as that generation started to die off, studios were bought by kind of American corporations. And then in the mid 80s, they started to be bought by multinationals, like News Corp bought 20th Century Fox, and then Sony bought Columbia. And the kind of valuations of studios were multiplying it. I mean, I think it was I don't remember off the top of my head what Coca-Cola. I think Coca-Cola bought Columbia. I think Coca-Cola
Yeah,
bought
yeah.
Columbia, and they owned it for like 5 years. And in that span, it's like it went from being valued at like $500 million to like 3 billion or something. It's like the sums just kept like multiplying, which of course that's capitalism. But I think that then budgets for movies and pay for stars started going up, and I think that changes the calculus. I can remember when I was a kid, an MGM or a United Artists would made Heaven's Gate for $40 million, and it was enough to bankrupt the studio or very nearly bankrupt it when the movie failed. And so, and as we moved into the 90s, suddenly movies were kind of routinely starting to cost 100 million, 150 million. Um, and, and once you do that, it becomes harder and harder for these places to be willing to take any risks at all. There's just too much money on the line. Or at least that was, I think what's worse is that now, these places could afford to lose tons of money. They actually can afford to take risks, but they don't do it. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I just uh, be interested to hear about your time at Fox 2000
yeah,
working
yeah,
exec. But yeah, hearing the death of the middle class film,
yeah,
I just for the life of me, I just where's movies where people just talk to each other?
yeah. I mean, sure. I think everybody. Look, I'm sure that anybody listening to this, I'm not. I'm not averse to, movies that are full of spectacle. It's like I'm looking forward to seeing, Mission Impossible, et cetera. But I do think that something is lost, and something really ineffable and important is lost when the people in movies stopped being people with the kinds of with the kind of with lives that have the same dimensions that ours do. And even though you can say, that it's like, oh, a movie like Nora, it's like, but they don't have that. Even a movie like that doesn't really feel that way anymore. I feel like the movies used to be a kind of mirror for people, and I'm not sure they really serve that function anymore. I think television has a little bit more, and even television, I think, is kind of sliding out of that somewhat.
Well, yeah, just having a movie set the conversation for people. Uh,
Right.
what everybody will talk about around the water cooler. Uh, did you see this? Did you see that?
Yes, yes, exactly. And of course, of course, most of us don't have water coolers anymore either. I mean, there's been this kind of concatenation of forces, and I don't just mean, the pandemic, which has kind of shaken up the whole notion of, going to work every day. But I think in a lot of ways, a lot has happened in the last, um, I would say 10, 15 years especially, where we don't spend as much time with other people in I mean, we don't really spend as much time with other people at all, right? I mean, even
Yeah,
basic things like running errands, you're like, well, I don't have to go to 10 different places to, to I just go online and order this or that, and it's like the ways in which the internet has sort of siloed us and, taken everything from, well, we used to go out to eat, but now we just order it from Uber, and we used to watch our movies, but now we can just stream it at home. And I think that's a bigger loss than we are willing to than we've really been able to reckon with. I think obviously, the movies are not and never were church exactly, but there was this place, and we would go and we would sit in a room with a bunch of strangers, and uh, and have a kind of shared encounter of some kind, a kind of a dream in common, or a story in common. And the loss of that has been very, uh, I think it takes something away that's much bigger than just the movies.
yeah, definitely. Uh, when you're working as an executive, first at Jersey Films and then
Yeah.
uh, it must have been hard to choose what to
Yeah, yeah. So
highlight.
these jobs, I was hired in the mid 1990s to basically um, find books and things to adapt into film. It was sort of, I had been working, I was living in San Francisco, and I'd been doing some sort of occasional consulting for Francis Coppola, and Francis actually said to me one day, like, oh, I need to hire someone to go to New York to find things to adapt into movies. And the moment he said it, I kind of couldn't believe that was a job. I thought, so the job is to go and read, and then he sort of, he kept kind of dragging his feet on doing it. And I thought, well, if it's good enough idea for him, it's a good enough idea for somebody else. And, and that's how I wound up working for, doing it first for Robert De Niro and then for Jersey Films, Danny DeVito's company. Um, and and what I quickly found out, I mean, I really didn't understand this before I started doing it, was that uh, there was a kind of axiom where they would say, my boss said, remember, bad books make great movies, and great books make bad movies. And it was meant a little, ironically, but there was some truth to that. The idea that a lot of great pieces of literature are not adaptable for, to make good movies, and you have a long tradition of novels that aren't necessarily high art, Jaws or The Godfather or Rosemary's Baby, I don't know about bad books, but they're not capital L
Yeah,
literature. And so I had to figure out, I was, and probably always have been, so focused on the quality of the writing. I tend to respond to something on the basis of its sentences, and so things would cross my desk, and I would just think, "You have to be kidding me! This is really not, it's not well written. It's not, and I would find out the hard way, where somebody else would pay $1 million for the rights to it or something, and I'd think like, oh, geez, no. uh, so I think I fought that the whole way, in a way that I probably wouldn't if I had the job today. I think I have a little bit more sense of like, what, how you could make a good movie out of a less than great piece of writing. But it's never been my first line of response when it comes to reading anything. I'm always going to be drawn by, is the writing good? Are the sentences beautiful? Is it intelligent? All these things that aren't necessarily precursors to being great cinema.
yeah, and it seems like popular books have the people who read it have a certain set of expectations.
Yes,
And so it'd
yes,
be extremely hard, well, not extremely, but hard to please everyone.
yes. I mean, I will say that the most exhilarating part of that job for me by far was, I was reading everything in manuscript, so I would, because my job was to basically try to get, editors and people at the agencies. I was trying to get them to, an author would deliver a book, and generally speaking, the hope was, an author and an agent would always want to control the submission. They would want to keep everything under wraps until they were ready, and then they would give it to the producers that they would want to give it to. And I was always trying to get my hands on stuff early so that we could, race it into the studio and try to get the studio to buy it for us before anybody else had it. So, the part that I most enjoyed was, when Don DeLillo delivered Underworld, or when Philip Roth delivered when a novelist I really loved, um, handed in a manuscript, and I would be reading a typescript of it, and in those days it was, I could be like, you could, it's like you could see the typos and the kind of slightly
Yeah, it
font.
wasn't like an ARC.
Yeah, yeah, it was incredible. I felt sort of, it felt somehow, it just felt very exciting in some weird way.
Well, as a librarian, I always like to end these talks, ask, what are you reading now?
Well, many things at once. I'll say, I am, on the one hand, it feels a little pretentious to admit it, but I've been on a serious Thomas Pynchon jag for a couple of months. I had not read Gravity's Rainbow since I was in my early 20s and way too young to understand it. And I reread it um, last summer, just as slowly and as meticulously, and it just it just blew my mind. And so it sent me on to reading Mason and Dixon, which I'm reading now, which is also quite wonderful. But on a slightly more modern tip, I'm reading a novel, a forthcoming novel by a writer named Michael Clune, Clune, called Pan, Pan, like the Greek god. And it's coming out in July, and it is just it's kind of knocked me out in a way that a recent piece of fiction hasn't for a little while. It's really special.
Cool.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, have you, oh, you have is this like the third book in your triptych of
Yeah,
all?
I am. Uh, once upon a time, I thought I might never write about the movies or Hollywood. I certainly didn't intend to do it for more than one book, but for reasons of just feeling like I had a little more to say, I wound up with this kind of with what I do consider to be a triptych. Um, the novel American Dream Machine, a kind of memoir and criticism called Always Crashing in the Same Car, and now this book. And I think they speak to each other and complement each other nicely. I do now have I have a novel in the very early stages of construction, so who knows what will happen to it. But it is not related to the motion picture industry at all, and not related to my parents, much more uh, forthrightly fictional, which is nice. Kind of a uh, well, I won't say too much. It's kind of a an elevated noir of a kind. So
Okay,
yeah,
yeah, that says a lot.
yeah.
So, have your feelings about Hollywood's changed or evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they've evolved simply because I really do, again, I don't if I say, I'm wary of anyone who just who declares an art form dead, right? It's every uh, couple of years somebody writes an essay about the death of the novel. Maybe that form is now dead too. Hopefully that, but I mean the form of the essay of complaining about the death of it. But I always feel like anytime someone sort of says, "Oh, an art form is dead," it's just it's such a fusty, boring. I mean, there are no shortage of good novels being written, and there are no shortage of movies being written. People are going to keep making movies, but Hollywood, the kind of the mechanism of it, that I think is over, and by which I mean it's in the same position that like radio was in the earlier part of the 20th century. I think that the studios have been um, outpaced by the streamers, and what the streamers do and make and will provide to us. They're not movies. They're really is something else. It's they use the term content, and I will say that it's content, and content is not the same thing. And I think it's only going to become uh, I think it's there will always be movies, or at least there will be movies for quite a while. But I don't think uh, the industry that supports that is gone. And so, I think what's changed is just my sense of its mortality. When you're in the center of that, when I was 22 or 23, and all the kind of big movie stars of my childhood were still big movie stars, and you sort of think, of course, it's always going to be this way. And then you get older and I mean, it's like I saw uh, Warren Beatty recently, out in town, and I just thought I can't, that man who was like, the the most handsome romantic lead in the world in my younger days is now a very, very, very old fellow, um, and so I see it from all over. I see that entire world vanishing, and which I think everybody does with whatever life they're leading. You get older and you start to understand that things you thought were always going to be there will not be, um, and um, and it's painful.
Yeah, yeah, I think it was maybe the Washington Post article about where they asked your dad, would what would you say to somebody who's starting out, and he'd be discouraging, or he wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do know those people who are starting out. I mean, and I don't think that. I mean, I don't remember what he said in the article, but I doubt that he really would be. I think he would be cautionary. And in fairness, he was cautionary to me when I was 22 or 23. He was like a writer. Are you sure? Do you know how difficult that is? And of course I did not know, but even if I had known, I would have done it anyway. And I think, there are a few things that make me happier. My daughter is 21, and she has friends who are about to graduate from college just like her, and there are a couple of them are people who want to work in the movies, and they're people with such a passionate love for film that I just feel like it's it's delightful. You can't help but look at those people and think, if this art form or if the world has any future, you have to encourage and try to help young people who want to do it. I feel that way about young people who want to be writers too. I mean, thank God. Um, but I think the material aspects of it are going to be very, very difficult. And I don't think that's unique to the movies. I think everybody in every profession, we're all kind of facing these problems with the threat of AI and oligarchy and all the things that are going to make it hard until we find a way to stop that.
Yeah, to understand it, and to find ways to deal with it.
Yeah.
So, uh, one more question. You're in previous talks, you talked about how fame affects people
Yeah. Yeah.
and how poisonous I guess, for lack of a better phrase, it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I think it depends on the person, and I sometimes think it depends on the age. I was I can't pretend to know him spectacularly well, but I do know him some. For example, the actor Walton Goggins, whose work has always been wonderful, but who has become, I think, has kind of achieved a kind of new level of fame, and I was sort of marveling recently when I saw him at the kind of ease and pleasure that he took in that, and it doesn't seem to have, he seems to delight in it without being, intoxicated or deformed by it. And I have seen that before there, yeah, and I think some of that is probably just that he's been doing what he does for a long time. I think sometimes when people become famous or successful very early, they don't know how to be a person. And I
Yeah,
think there are people, like Walton, where they very much know how to be a person. They are a person, and so the performance part feels like a blessing, and is, I think. But for the most part, I think that fame, again, like extreme wealth, it can erode empathy. In ways that I think are just so human. If you kind of walk through the world and everybody treats you like you're not normal, or like you're special, or like you're more important than other people, then you start to believe that. I mean, I think I can't speak that way for myself because I haven't been treated that way, and I hope I never am. But it is not, that's not an experience that's conducive um, to having a kind of proportionate sense of yourself in the world.
well, you're only human. I mean, even the most ethical and moral person would be like, hey, I sort of believe it.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think
It's
it,
it's 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 incredibly seductive to believe it, especially because, most artists, I certainly include myself in this, go into it with some sense of kind of personal inadequacy, or some kind of injury, some sense of, I certainly didn't grow up I think part of why I became a writer was because I wanted to feel, I don't know about special, but I wanted to find a way to feel loved. uh, and
yeah, appreciate it.
yeah,
Yeah,
appreciate it. That's correct. Or seen in some way. I think seen
yeah,
is
yeah, right,
recognized. And I
right.
think recognized is, it's complicated, because, sometimes even with this book and the last book, both of which are pretty intimate feeling, and I've had people sort of say, God, I feel like I know you so well. And I always have this feeling like, well, first, I think like that's lovely. Like if the book can forge that kind of experience for a reader, I think that's great. And I try to embrace that, but I also feel like, there's this part of me that always thinks, yeah, but no, because that's not exactly me, it's a it's a creation. It's a fiction.
Yeah, 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 yeah. How can you don't know what the other person, yeah, is thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move on to the Q&A section. If anybody online has a question, just press the button at the bottom and type in your question. But I'll get it started. Have writing this triptych help you understand your parents better?
Yes, actually. Yeah, I think it has. I mean, or I mean, understand is, this book was very interesting because I felt like I really had to kind of try to inhabit my parents, who they were all the way through their lives. And that means before they knew me, during my childhood, in later life. And, there was a sense of, obviously my mom left some journals and my dad was, available to be interviewed or ask questions. But I still had to stretch it a little bit. And at the end of it, I still feel like, well, on one level, there's still mysteries to me, as one's parents will always be. On another level, I feel like I understood them better than I thought I did. There were moments in their lives where I thought, oh yeah, that's why they did X or Y. Um, but I think more than understand them, I think it sort of helped me um, accommodate them, for who they are, and kind of accept, and not just accept, adore the people that they are, because even my mom was a difficult parent, but I really, I loved her enormously, and I feel the same about my dad. And he really loves this book, which is itself kind of funny, being written about in this way. He just loves it, and so it's done a kind of nice thing for our relationship.
Cool. Uh, and is you've talked about how people starting out in the business are very passionate, but in the sense that the people you know, the people you run into, uh, is working in the movie business fun?
Yes, I don't think that anybody would do it if, I mean, in some sense, um, it is, there's an element to it that's nightmarish, and that element tends to be its unpredictability, um, the number of times you get your heart broken. I have said to people before that it is a business in which it is always, 2 a.m. at the casino, meaning, it's like any bet you place is kind of a bad bet. You're probably going to get bitten by it, but it's very, very hard to cut your losses and go home. and and at the same time, the moments of joy or creative satisfaction, even just of creative possibility, are so thrilling. I mean, it's in my time as a writer, I have, um, been hired to write things, sold pitches, and so on. And I've written quite a few things, and none of them have been produced. Um, and yet sometimes, you get, I've come so close on so many projects so many times that it's like even those moments where you sort of feel like, where the movie kind of comes together, and then an actor will leave, or a director will, something will happen, the whole thing will fall apart. But it's like I've had moments that were just like, wow, this is fantastic, um uh you know and so, yeah, of course it's exciting. I don't think anybody, I think that everybody who works in it on some level will admit that the excitement is probably the biggest incentive to doing it.
Well, did you feel that way when you're adapting the Transit of Venus?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, I did. I mean, that's a movie that came, I mean, it was the first script I ever wrote, and it was such a complicated it was a book that had been attempted by, people. I've never found verification on this, but there were all these rumors. Oh, Tom Stoppard tried to do it, and David Hare, the English playwright. So even when I took it on, I thought, well, this is going to be almost impossible. And the fact that I, made the script work, we sold it to Warner Brothers, and then just working on it and having these moments when, I remember, it was for a smaller part, but we sent the script to Peter O'Toole, and when he was alive, and he agreed to do it, and I remember just thinking, I can't believe that, Lawrence of Arabia is gonna do he wants to be in my movie, and there were a lot of people like that where there's something very thrilling about writing something and having people like that respond to it. It kind of blows your mind when it happens the first time.
I bet. I
Yeah.
bet. So, okay, it doesn't look like anybody have any questions. So, uh, come to a conclusion. Thanks a lot, Matthew.
Yeah. Thanks for
Just
having me. A real
this is
pleasure.
yeah, this is a just want to say thank you. Wonderful,
Oh,
wonderful writing.
anytime. Really, I
Right.
greatly appreciate it. Yeah.
Great, appreciate it. So, thank you very much, and
Yeah.
have a good evening.
Cheers. You too.